What if I told you that one single verse in the Bible completely destroys the European image of Jesus that has dominated Christianity for centuries? What if the same scripture that missionaries used to justify slavery actually proves that Jesus Christ was a black man who lived among African people in ancient Egypt? Tonight we're diving into Matthew 2:15, a verse so explosive that it's been hidden in plain sight for over 2,000 years. Out of Egypt I called my son. 5 simple words that shatter everything you thought you knew about the Messiah's identity. This isn't just about correcting historical records. This is about reclaiming the true face of God from those who stole it, whitewashed it, and used it as a weapon against the very people who look like him. The evidence we're about to uncover will shock you, challenge you, and ultimately set you free from centuries of religious deception. For too long, the church has presented us with a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus who looks nothing like the people of first-century Palestine. But what if this deliberate distortion wasn't just artistic preference? What if it was part of a calculated campaign to erase Africa from the biblical narrative and make Christianity a tool of European supremacy? The truth has been buried, but tonight we're digging it up. Are you ready to see Jesus as he really was? Let me take you back to a moment that would forever alter human history, recorded in Matthew chapter 2, verse 15. When Herod the Great ordered the massacre of innocent children in Bethlehem, an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream with urgent instructions. "Take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt," the angel commanded, "for Herod will search for the child to destroy him." So Joseph arose, took Mary and baby Jesus, and escaped under cover of darkness to the land of the Pharaohs. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. Matthew doesn't just record this as a historical event. He connects it directly to ancient prophecy, writing that this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, saying, "Out of Egypt I called my son." This quotation comes from Hosea 3:1, where God speaks of calling Israel out of Egyptian bondage, but Matthew is making a revolutionary claim here. He's saying that Jesus, the Son of God, literally fulfilled this prophecy by being called out of Egypt, just like the nation of Israel. Think about the profound implications of this connection. The Holy Family didn't just visit Egypt as tourists passing through. They lived there, integrated into Egyptian society, and became part of the African diaspora. The Hebrew word used in Hosea is kara, which means to call, summon, or invite. This suggests an intimate relationship between God and his people in the land of Egypt. Jesus wasn't just hiding in Egypt. He was being formed by Egypt, shaped by its culture, and prepared for his ministry in an African context. The timing of this Egyptian sojourn is crucial to understanding Jesus' identity. According to most biblical scholars, the Holy Family remained in Egypt for approximately 2 to 3 years, from when Jesus was an infant until Herod's death around 4 BC. This means Jesus spent his most formative early years in Africa, absorbing the sights, sounds, and rhythms of Egyptian life. His first words may have been spoken in Coptic or Egyptian Aramaic. His earliest memories would have been of African faces, African food, and African customs. But there's something even more significant hidden in this verse that most Christians never discover. The phrase "out of Egypt I called my son" uses the Hebrew word ben, which means son but also carries connotations of belonging and identity. When God calls Jesus his son out of Egypt, he's not just describing a geographical movement, he's declaring that Jesus' identity was fundamentally shaped by his African experience. The Son of God emerged from Africa, carrying within himself the wisdom, strength, and spiritual depth of the continent that birthed human civilization. Matthew's use of this Hosea quotation also reveals something profound about God's heart for Africa in the original context. Hosea 11:21 speaks of God's tender love for Israel as a young nation. "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." By applying this same language to Jesus, Matthew is showing us that God's love affair with Africa didn't end with the Exodus. It continued through his own son, who found refuge, safety, and nurture in African soil. The early church fathers understood this connection far better than modern Christianity does. Origen of Alexandria, himself an African theologian, wrote extensively about the significance of Jesus' time in Egypt. He saw it as proof that the gospel was always intended for all nations, beginning with Africa. Athanasius, another African church father, argued that Jesus' Egyptian sojourn demonstrated God's special love for the continent that had sheltered his son in times of danger. Archaeological evidence continues to confirm the deep connections between first-century Palestine and Africa. Recent excavations in Egypt have uncovered Jewish communities that flourished during the time of Jesus, complete with synagogues, ritual baths, and Hebrew inscriptions. These weren't isolated settlements. They were thriving communities where Jewish families like Joseph, Mary, and Jesus could easily blend in and find acceptance. The idea that they stood out as foreigners simply doesn't match the historical record. But perhaps the most shocking revelation comes from understanding the demographics of first-century Egypt itself. This wasn't the Egypt of Hollywood movies populated by fair-skinned actors. This was ancient Kemet, the Black Land, inhabited primarily by dark-skinned Africans who had built one of the world's greatest civilizations. When the Holy Family fled to Egypt, they were entering a predominantly black African society. For them to blend in and avoid detection, as the biblical accounts suggest they did, they would have needed to look like the people around them. Can you handle what this means for everything you've been taught about Jesus? The time has come to shatter one of history's most persistent lies. For centuries, Hollywood, academia, and even some religious institutions have tried to convince us that ancient Egypt was somehow separate from Africa, populated by people who looked more European than African. But the evidence is overwhelming, undeniable, and absolutely shocking. Ancient Egypt was not just in Africa, it was thoroughly, completely, and proudly African in every sense of the word. Let's start with the most basic geographical fact that somehow gets overlooked in many discussions. Egypt is in Africa. The Nile River, which gave life to Egyptian civilization, flows from the heart of Africa, through Sudan and into the Mediterranean. The ancient Egyptians themselves called their land Kemet, which literally means the Black Land, referring both to the fertile black soil of the Nile Delta and to the dark-skinned people who inhabited it. This wasn't a metaphor or poetic language, this was their actual identity. The Greek historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, visited Egypt in the 5th century BC and left us detailed descriptions of what he saw. He wrote that the Egyptians had black skin and woolly hair, distinguishing them clearly from other Mediterranean peoples. Herodotus wasn't making a political statement. He was simply recording what any honest observer could see. The Egyptians were African people with African features, African culture, and African spiritual traditions. But the evidence goes far beyond ancient testimonies. Modern DNA analysis of Egyptian mummies has revealed genetic markers that link ancient Egyptians directly to sub-Saharan African populations. A groundbreaking 2017 study published in Nature Communications analyzed the genetic material from 151 Egyptian mummies spanning over 300 years of history. The results were clear and unambiguous. Ancient Egyptians shared more genetic ancestry with modern-day Africans than with any other population group. The artistic evidence is equally compelling and impossible to ignore. Walk through any authentic Egyptian museum, and you'll see statue after statue, painting after painting depicting people with distinctly African features. The famous bust of Queen Nefertiti shows a woman with clearly African bone structure. The golden mask of Tutankhamun reveals a young pharaoh with full lips and broad nose typical of African ancestry. These weren't artistic stylizations, they were accurate representations of how these rulers actually looked. Even more significant are the numerous depictions of Egyptian gods and goddesses with unmistakably African features. Isis, the great mother goddess who was worshipped throughout the ancient world, is consistently portrayed with dark skin and African characteristics. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, appears in tomb paintings with the deep black skin that the Egyptians associated with fertility and rebirth. These divine images reflect the appearance of the people who created them. The religious and cultural connections between Egypt and the rest of Africa are profound and undeniable. Egyptian creation myths, funeral practices, and spiritual belief show clear parallels with traditions found throughout sub-Saharan Africa. The concept of Mart, the Egyptian principle of truth and justice, mirrors similar concepts found in African societies from Ethiopia to South Africa. This wasn't cultural borrowing. This was a shared African worldview expressing itself through Egyptian civilization. Consider the testimony of the ancient Egyptians themselves about their origins. The Turin Papyrus, one of the most important Egyptian historical documents, traces the lineage of the pharaohs back to the gods who ruled from the south, clearly indicating an African origin for Egyptian civilization. The Palermo stone, another crucial historical record, describes the earliest Egyptian rulers as coming from Upper Egypt, the region closest to the heart of Africa. The linguistic evidence is equally powerful. Ancient Egyptian belongs to the Afroasiatic language family, which includes languages spoken throughout North and East Africa. Many Egyptian words show clear cognates with languages still spoken in Sudan, Ethiopia, and other African nations. The hieroglyphic writing system itself may have evolved from earlier African symbolic systems found in Nubia and other regions south of Egypt. Archaeological discoveries continue to confirm Egypt's deep African roots. Excavations at sites like Nata Playa in southern Egypt have revealed sophisticated astronomical alignments and ceremonial structures that predate Stonehenge by thousands of years. These discoveries show that the scientific and architectural achievements we associate with Egyptian civilization actually emerged from earlier African cultures in the Sahara and Nile Valley. The ancient Greeks and Romans, despite their own cultural biases, consistently recognized Egypt as part of Africa and Egyptians as African people. Classical writers like Diodorus Siculus and Strabo described Egypt as an African civilization with African characteristics. They didn't see any contradiction between Egypt's greatness and its African identity because they understood what modern scholarship has tried to obscure. But perhaps the most powerful evidence comes from the Egyptians' own religious texts and burial practices. The Book of the Dead, the Pyramid texts, and other sacred writings consistently describe the afterlife as located in the south, in the direction of Africa's interior. The pharaohs were buried with their heads pointing south, toward the heart of Africa. Because that's where they believed their spiritual homeland lay, they knew they were African and they were proud of it. The implications of this truth are staggering for our understanding of Jesus' time in Egypt when the Holy Family fled to this land. They weren't entering some racially ambiguous Mediterranean society. They were entering the heart of Black Africa, a civilization built by and for African people. For Jesus to blend in and avoid detection in this environment tells us everything we need to know about his own appearance and identity. What does this mean for the European Jesus that hangs in churches across America? Picture this scene that will forever change how you see the Christmas story. Under a star-filled desert sky, a young Jewish carpenter named Joseph leads a donkey carrying his wife Mary and their infant son Jesus along the ancient trade routes toward Egypt. They're not tourists on a sightseeing expedition, they're refugees fleeing for their lives, carrying nothing but hope and the promise that God will protect his son in the land of the pharaohs. But here's what most Christians never realize about this journey. When the Holy Family crossed into Egypt, they weren't entering foreign territory where they would stand out as obvious foreigners. They were entering a land with a massive Jewish population that had been thriving there for centuries. Alexandria alone had over 100,000 Jewish residents, making it one of the largest Jewish communities in the ancient world. These weren't recent immigrants. These were established communities with synagogues, schools, and businesses that had been part of Egyptian society for generations. The Jewish community in Egypt during the 1st century was incredibly diverse, representing Jews from across the Mediterranean world and beyond. Many had intermarried with local Egyptians over the centuries, creating a population that reflected the full spectrum of Middle Eastern and African ancestry. When Joseph, Mary, and Jesus arrived in this community, they would have encountered people who looked like them, spoke their language, and shared their faith while also being fully integrated into Egyptian African society. Archaeological evidence reveals the remarkable sophistication of these Jewish Egyptian communities. Excavations at sites like Elephantine Island have uncovered papyrus documents written in Aramaic, the same language Jesus spoke, dating back centuries before his birth. These documents reveal a vibrant Jewish community that maintained its religious identity while fully participating in Egyptian economic and social life. They built synagogues that incorporated Egyptian architectural elements, created art that blended Jewish and Egyptian motifs, and developed religious practices that honored both their Jewish heritage and their African home. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that the Holy Family remained in Egypt until Herod's death, which most scholars date to around 4 BC. This means Jesus spent approximately 2 to 3 years of his early childhood in Africa, during the most formative period of human development. These weren't just months of hiding. These were years of growth, learning, and cultural absorption that would have profoundly shaped his worldview and identity. Consider what daily life would have looked like for the young Jesus in Egypt. He would have played with African children, heard African languages spoken in the marketplace, watched African craftsmen at work, and absorbed the rhythms of African life. His earliest memories would have included the sound of Egyptian music, the taste of African food, and the sight of the great monuments that testified to Africa's ancient wisdom and power. The boy who would grow up to challenge the religious establishment of his day was being formed in the heart of African civilization. The Coptic Christian tradition, which traces its roots directly back to the apostolic era, preserves detailed accounts of the Holy Family's time in Egypt. According to these ancient sources, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus traveled throughout Egypt, staying in various communities and receiving hospitality from both Jewish and Egyptian families. The Copts identify specific locations where the Holy Family lived, including sites in Cairo, Asiut, and other cities that remain pilgrimage destinations to this day. These Coptic traditions describe miraculous events that occurred during Jesus' childhood in Egypt, including healing springs that appeared wherever the infant Jesus was bathed and fruit trees that bowed down to offer their produce to the Holy Family. While we might interpret these stories symbolically, they reveal something profound about how the early African church understood Jesus' connection to their land. They saw him not as a foreign visitor but as someone who belonged to Africa and was blessed by his time there. The economic implications of the Holy Family's Egyptian sojourn are also significant. Joseph was a tekton, a skilled craftsman who worked with wood, stone, and metal. In Egypt, such skills were highly valued and well compensated. The great building projects of the Ptolemaic period required skilled artisans, and Jewish craftsmen were particularly respected for their quality work. Joseph would have found steady employment and been able to provide well for his family during their time in Africa. But perhaps most importantly, Jesus' time in Egypt would have exposed him to the profound spiritual traditions of African civilization. Egypt was the birthplace of many religious concepts that would later appear in Jesus' teachings, including the emphasis on resurrection, the importance of caring for the poor and oppressed, and the understanding of divine kingship. The wisdom literature of Egypt, including texts like the instructions of Tao-Tep and the maxims of Amenemhotep, contains ethical teachings that closely parallel the moral instructions found in the Hebrew Bible and Jesus' own parables. The Hebrew concept of Hokmah, or wisdom, that appears throughout the Old Testament has deep connections to Egyptian Ma'at, the principle of truth, justice, and cosmic order. When Jesus later taught about the kingdom of heaven and the principles of righteous living, he was drawing on a wisdom tradition that had been nurtured and developed in Africa for thousands of years. His parables about justice, mercy, and the reversal of worldly power structures echo themes that were central to African spiritual thought long before his birth. The Gospel accounts suggest that the Holy Family's departure from Egypt was as divinely orchestrated as their arrival. Matthew 220 records that after Herod's death, an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead." The use of the phrase young child rather than baby suggests that Jesus had grown and developed significantly during his time in Africa. When the Holy Family left Egypt and returned to Nazareth, they carried with them not just memories but a transformed understanding of God's global purposes. Jesus had experienced firsthand the hospitality of African people, the wisdom of African civilization, and the protection of African soil. This experience would profoundly influence his later ministry and his understanding of the gospel as good news for all nations, not just the Jewish people. The implications of this African sojourn extend far beyond historical curiosity. They reveal a Jesus who was shaped by African culture, protected by African hospitality, and formed by African wisdom. This is not the European Jesus of medieval art but the authentic Jesus of history, a man whose identity was fundamentally connected to the African continent and its people. Are you ready to discover what this means for his physical appearance? The time has come to examine what the Bible itself actually says about Jesus' physical appearance, and prepare yourself for revelations that will shatter every European depiction you've ever seen. The scriptures contain specific, detailed descriptions of Jesus that point unmistakably to African features, but these passages have been ignored, mistranslated, or deliberately obscured by those who couldn't handle the truth about their Savior's identity. Let's start with the most explosive passage in the entire Bible regarding Jesus' appearance. Revelation 1:14-15 provides John's eyewitness description of the glorified Christ. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. Now, most preachers rush past this description or spiritualize it away, but let's examine what John is actually telling us. The phrase hair like wool is crucial and cannot be dismissed. The Greek word used here is irion, which specifically refers to the wool of sheep, not the fine hair of Europeans. Wool has a distinctive texture, curl pattern, and appearance that is completely different from straight hair. When John says Jesus' hair was like wool, he's describing the natural hair texture of African people. This isn't metaphorical language about color or spiritual purity. This is a literal description of hair texture that matches what we see in people of African descent. But it gets even more specific. The description of Jesus' feet as like bronze glowing in a furnace uses the Greek word chakos, referring to a bronze alloy that becomes dark reddish-brown when heated. This isn't describing pale European skin that might have a slight tan. This is describing the deep, rich brown skin tone characteristic of African and Middle Eastern peoples. The imagery of bronze refined in a furnace suggests skin that is naturally dark, not temporarily darkened by sun exposure. The book of Daniel provides another crucial piece of evidence that connects directly to John's vision. Daniel 10:6 describes a heavenly messenger whose body was like beryl, his face like lightning, his eyes like torches of fire, his arms and feet like burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the voice of a multitude. The parallel language between Daniel's vision and John's description of Jesus' exists suggests they're seeing the same divine being, and both emphasize the bronze-colored skin that was characteristic of the region's inhabitants. But let's go even deeper into the Hebrew and Greek texts to uncover truths that have been hidden from English-speaking Christians. The Song of Solomon, traditionally interpreted as an allegory of Christ's love for the church, contains a fascinating self-description in chapter 1, verse 5. The bride declares, "I am black and beautiful." Ascertain the context and ensure it is suitable for a voiceover and manageable for an illustration. The Hebrew word used for black here is shatter, which means dark, dusky, or black-skinned. While some scholars argue this refers to being darkened by the sun, the comparison to the tents of Kedar is significant. Kedar was a tribe of dark-skinned Arabs who lived in black goat hair tents. The comparison isn't about temporary tanning but about natural skin color. If this passage is indeed allegorical of Christ, as centuries of Christian interpretation have maintained, then it's describing a dark-skinned Messiah who identifies with the beauty and dignity of African features. The genealogical evidence in the Gospel also points toward African ancestry. Matthew's genealogy of Jesus includes several women whose ethnic backgrounds suggest African connections. Tamar, who appears in Jesus' lineage, was likely a Canaanite woman. Rahab was from Jericho, a city with significant African influence. Ruth was a Moabite, and the Moabites were descendants of Lot who had connections to African peoples. Most significantly, Bathsheba was married to Uriah the Hittite, and the Hittites were known to include people of African descent. The prophet Isaiah provides another crucial clue about the Messiah's appearance in his famous suffering servant passage. Isaiah 53:2 states, "He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him." This suggests that Jesus didn't conform to the conventional standards of attractiveness in his culture. In a society that often associated beauty with lighter skin, this description makes perfect sense if Jesus had the darker skin typical of African peoples. Archaeological evidence from 1st century Palestine supports these biblical descriptions. Skeletal remains from the period show that the average inhabitant of the region had features consistent with Middle Eastern and North African populations. The idea of a pale, European-looking Jesus simply doesn't match the anthropological evidence from his time and place. The early church fathers, many of whom were African themselves, had no difficulty accepting a dark-skinned Jesus. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, described Jesus as having an inglorious appearance that didn't conform to Greek standards of beauty. Tertullian, an African church father, wrote that Jesus had a humble form and ignoble appearance that reflected his identification with the oppressed and marginalized. Even more telling are the earliest artistic depictions of Jesus from the Roman catacombs and early Christian sites. These images, created by people who lived much closer to Jesus' time than Renaissance artists, consistently show him with darker skin, fuller lips, and broader features characteristic of Middle Eastern and African peoples. The famous Christ Pancrator icon from St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt, dating to the 6th century, depicts Jesus with distinctly non-European features. The linguistic evidence also supports an African connection. Jesus spoke Aramaic, a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew and Arabic. Many Aramaic words and phrases have cognates in African languages, particularly those spoken in Ethiopia and other parts of East Africa. This linguistic connection suggests ongoing cultural and genetic exchange between the Middle East and Africa throughout ancient history. But perhaps the most powerful evidence comes from understanding the demographics of 1st century Galilee, where Jesus spent most of his life. This region was called Galilee of the Gentiles because of its diverse population, which included significant numbers of people with African ancestry. The Via Maris, the great trade route that connected Africa to Asia, passed directly through Galilee, bringing constant contact with African merchants, settlers, and travelers. The implications of this biblical evidence are staggering. The Jesus described in Scripture bears no resemblance to the European figure that has dominated Christian art for centuries. Instead, we see a man with African features, African hair texture, and the bronze-colored skin characteristic of the peoples who inhabited the ancient Middle East and North Africa. This isn't about political correctness or modern racial categories. This is about biblical accuracy and historical truth. The Jesus of the Bible was a man who looked like the majority of people living in his region during his time, and those people had features that we would recognize today as African or Middle Eastern. not European. What does this revelation mean for the whitewashed Christianity that has dominated the Western world? Prepare yourself for one of history's most shocking cover-ups, a deliberate campaign of cultural theft that spans over 1,000 years and continues to this day. The transformation of Jesus from a dark-skinned African-featured Middle Eastern man into a blonde-haired, blue-eyed European was not an accident of artistic interpretation. It was a calculated act of religious colonialism designed to make Christianity serve the interests of European power and white supremacy. The story begins in the 4th century when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and began the process of making it the official religion of the Roman Empire. Suddenly, a faith that had been born among the oppressed and marginalized became the religion of the powerful and privileged. This transformation required more than just political acceptance. It required a complete reimagining of Jesus' identity to make him acceptable to European sensibilities and useful for European ambitions. The earliest Christian art, found in the Roman catacombs and dating to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, consistently depicted Jesus with the darker skin and Middle Eastern features that would have been historically accurate. These images were created by Christians who lived much closer to Jesus' time and had access to oral traditions about his appearance. But as Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, these authentic depictions began to disappear, replaced by images that made Jesus look more like a Roman emperor than a Jewish carpenter. The process accelerated during the medieval period as European artists began creating religious art for churches and monasteries across the continent. These artists had never traveled to the Middle East, had no knowledge of 1st century Palestinian demographics, and were painting for audiences who expected to see familiar European faces. More importantly, they were working for patrons who wanted religious art that reinforced their own power and authority. A European-looking Jesus served these purposes perfectly. But the real transformation came during the Renaissance when artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael created the iconic images of Jesus that still dominate Christianity today. These artists weren't trying to achieve historical accuracy. They were creating idealized European figures that reflected the aesthetic preferences and racial assumptions of their time. Da Vinci's The Last Supper and Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam established visual templates for Jesus that had nothing to do with biblical truth and everything to do with European artistic tradition. The most influential single image in shaping modern perceptions of Jesus was created by Warner Salmon, an American artist who painted Head of Christ in 1940. This painting, showing Jesus with flowing brown hair, fair skin, and blue eyes, was mass-produced and distributed to churches, homes, and schools across America and around the world. Millions of Christians grew up seeing this image and accepting it as an accurate representation of their Savior, never questioning its historical basis or cultural assumptions. The spread of this European Jesus image was not accidental but was actively promoted by missionary organizations as they carried Christianity to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Colonial powers understood that religion could be a powerful tool of control, and a white Jesus helped reinforce the message that European civilization was superior and divinely blessed. When African slaves were forced to convert to Christianity, they were presented with images of a white savior who looked like their oppressors, a psychological manipulation designed to reinforce their subjugation. The impact of this religious colonialism cannot be overstated. Malcolm X famously criticized Christianity as the white man's religion precisely because of how it had been weaponized to serve European interests. He argued that teaching black people to worship a white Jesus was a form of mental slavery that prevented them from recognizing their own dignity and worth. While Malcolm's critique was harsh, it identified a real problem with how Christianity had been distorted to serve racist ideologies. The Catholic Church played a central role in promoting and institutionalizing the European image of Jesus. Vatican art collections are filled with paintings and sculptures that depict Jesus, Mary, and the apostles as Europeans, despite the historical impossibility of this representation. When Catholic missionaries carried Christianity around the world, they brought these images with them, establishing European depictions of Jesus as the global standard for Christian art. The Protestant Reformation, despite its many positive contributions, did little to challenge the European monopoly on Jesus' image. Protestant churches continued to use European artistic traditions and even intensified the whitening of Christianity in some ways. The emphasis on biblical authority could have led to a more historically accurate understanding of Jesus' appearance, but most Protestant leaders were too embedded in European culture to question their assumptions about race and identity. The development of printing technology in the 15th and 16th centuries accelerated the spread of European Jesus images. Bibles, prayer books, and religious tracts could now be mass-produced with illustrations that reinforced the white Jesus narrative. These printed images reached far more people than paintings in churches ever could, embedding the European Jesus deeply in Christian consciousness across the globe. The rise of Hollywood in the 20th century gave the European Jesus unprecedented global reach. Movies like The Greatest Story Ever Told, King of Kings, and The Passion of the Christ featured white actors playing Jesus and reached audiences of millions around the world. These films, despite their religious themes, were products of an entertainment industry that reflected and reinforced white supremacist assumptions about beauty, heroism, and divinity. The psychological impact of the white Jesus image on people of color has been devastating and continues to this day. Children growing up in African, Asian, and Latin American churches are taught to worship a savior who looks nothing like them, sending the implicit message that whiteness is associated with hollowness and divinity, while their own features are somehow less blessed or beautiful. This religious racism has contributed to colorism, self-hatred, and internalized oppression in communities around the world. But the theft of Jesus' identity wasn't just about changing his appearance, it was about changing his message and mission to serve European interests. The Jesus of European Christianity became a figure who blessed conquest, justified slavery, and sanctioned the oppression of non-European peoples. This was a complete reversal of the biblical Jesus who identified with the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized. The economic dimensions of this cultural theft are staggering. The Christian art market, dominated by European and European-inspired images, is worth billions of dollars annually. Publishers, filmmakers, and artists have profited enormously from perpetuating the white Jesus myth, while authentic representations of the historical Jesus remain marginalized and underfunded. Recent archaeological and anthropological research has provided increasingly clear evidence about what first-century Palestinians actually looked like, but this scientific data has been largely ignored by mainstream Christianity. Computer-generated reconstructions based on skeletal remains from the period show Jesus would have had darker skin, broader features, and shorter stature than European depictions suggest. But these historically accurate images remain controversial in many Christian circles. The resistance to acknowledging Jesus' true appearance reveals the depth of white supremacist thinking that has infected Christianity. Many Christians become defensive or angry when confronted with evidence that Jesus was not European, revealing how deeply their faith has become entangled with racial identity and cultural superiority. This reaction demonstrates that the theft of Jesus' identity was not just an artistic choice, but a fundamental distortion of Christian theology. Can you handle the truth about what this means for modern Christianity? Deep in the heart of Africa, in churches that trace their roots back to the apostolic era, a different story of Jesus has been preserved for nearly 2,000 years. While European Christianity was busy whitewashing the Messiah's image, African Christians maintained traditions, teachings, and understandings that reveal the true identity of the Son of God. What they know will revolutionize your faith and challenge everything you've been taught about early Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian denominations in the world, has never accepted the European version of Jesus. Their ancient icons, manuscripts, and liturgical traditions consistently depict Christ with African features, dark skin, and the physical characteristics of the people who have worshipped him in Africa for centuries. These aren't modern innovations or politically correct revisions. These are traditions that date back to the 4th century, when Ethiopia became one of the first nations to officially adopt Christianity. Ethiopian church tradition holds that the Queen of Sheba, who visited King Solomon in Jerusalem, was actually Queen Makeda of Ethiopia. According to the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of the Kings, an ancient Ethiopian text, she had a son named Menelik by Solomon, establishing a direct connection between the Ethiopian royal line and the House of David. This tradition places Ethiopia at the center of biblical history and suggests that the Messiah's lineage includes African ancestry through the Solomonic line. The Coptic Orthodox Church of Egypt, which claims direct apostolic succession from the evangelist Mark, has preserved some of the earliest Christian art and literature in existence. Coptic depictions of Jesus consistently show him with the darker skin and African features that would have been typical of first-century Palestinians. The famous Christ Panicrator icon from St. Karen's Monastery in Egypt, dating to the 6th century, shows Jesus with distinctly non-European characteristics that reflect the authentic traditions of the early church. African church fathers like Origen of Alexandria, Athanasius of Alexandria, and Augustine of Hippo were among the most influential theologians in early Christianity. Yet their African identity has been systematically downplayed or ignored by European church historians. These brilliant scholars, who helped establish fundamental Christian doctrines like the Trinity and the dual nature of Christ, understood Jesus in ways that reflected their African context and perspective. The ancient Nubian kingdoms, located in what is now Sudan, were among the earliest Christian nations in the world. Archaeological excavations have uncovered magnificent churches, monasteries, and Christian art that flourished for over 1,000 years. Nubian Christian art consistently depicts Jesus, Mary, and the saints with African features, demonstrating that this was the normative understanding of Christian identity in this region. But perhaps the most powerful evidence comes from the oral traditions that have been passed down through generations of African Christians. These traditions speak of Jesus as someone who looked like them, understood their struggles, and identified with their experiences of oppression and marginalization. For African Christians who lived under colonialism and slavery, the knowledge that Jesus was a person of color provided spiritual strength and resistance against those who used a white Jesus to justify their oppression. The Ethiopian Bible, which includes books not found in European versions of Scripture, contains additional details about Jesus' appearance and identity. The Book of Enoch, considered canonical by Ethiopian Christians, describes the Messiah in terms that align with African physical characteristics. While these texts are not accepted by all Christian denominations, they represent ancient traditions that predate European influence on Christianity. African American churches developed their own traditions of resistance to the white Jesus image, often in subtle ways that avoided direct confrontation with white authorities. Spirituals like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and Go Down, Moses connected the biblical narrative to the African American experience of slavery and liberation. These songs implicitly understood Jesus as someone who identified with the oppressed, not with their oppressors. The rise of Black liberation theology in the 20th century brought these underground truths into academic and theological discourse. Scholars like James Cone argued that Jesus' identification with the poor and oppressed meant that he must be understood as Black in the American context, not because of his physical appearance, but because of his solidarity with those who suffer under white supremacy. This theological insight helped African American Christians reclaim Jesus from those who had used him to justify racism. Contemporary African theologians continue to develop Christologies that reflect African understandings of Jesus' identity and mission. Scholars like John Mbidi, Mercy Amba Odioi, and Kwembiako have articulated visions of Jesus that draw on African cultural concepts, spiritual traditions, and experiences of community and liberation. Their work demonstrates that African Christianity is not simply European Christianity transplanted to African soil, but a distinctive expression of the gospel that reflects African wisdom and insight. The growth of African Christianity in the 21st century has created new opportunities for authentic representations of Jesus to emerge. With over 600 million Christians in Africa today, the continent has become the center of global Christianity, and African voices are increasingly challenging European assumptions about Christian identity and practice. African artists, filmmakers, and writers are creating new images of Jesus that reflect biblical truth rather than European fantasy. But the underground truth that African Christians know extends beyond questions of physical appearance to deeper issues of identity, mission, and purpose. They understand that Jesus came not to establish European civilization or justify white supremacy, but to liberate all people from oppression and to establish God's kingdom of justice and peace. This understanding has sustained African Christians through centuries of colonialism, slavery, and racism. The testimonies of African Christians who have encountered Jesus in visions, dreams, and spiritual experiences consistently describe him in ways that align with African identity rather than European imagery. These personal revelations, while not scriptural in authority, provide powerful testimony to the ways that God reveals himself to people in culturally relevant forms that speak to their hearts and experiences. The preservation of these underground truths represents one of the most important acts of resistance in Christian history. Despite centuries of pressure to conform to European standards and expectations, African Christians maintained their understanding of Jesus as someone who looked like them, understood their struggles, and identified with their hopes for liberation and justice. The implications of these underground truths extend far beyond questions of historical accuracy. They reveal that Christianity has always been a global, multicultural faith that transcends racial and ethnic boundaries. The attempt to make Jesus exclusively European was not just historically false but theologically heretical, representing a fundamental misunderstanding of the gospel's universal message. As African Christianity continues to grow and influence global Christianity, these underground truths are becoming harder to suppress or ignore. The authentic Jesus of history, the Jesus who was shaped by African culture and identified with African people, is emerging from the shadows where he has been hidden for too long. What does this mean for the future of Christianity in America and around the world? The time has come to examine the hard scientific evidence that completely validates what the Bible has been telling us all along about Jesus' identity and appearance. Modern archaeology, genetics, and anthropology have provided us with unprecedented insights into the demographics and physical characteristics of first-century Palestinians. And the results are absolutely shocking for anyone who still believes in the European Jesus myth. Let's start with the most groundbreaking archaeological discovery of recent decades. In 2001, Israeli archaeologist Yosef Gad uncovered a first-century tomb in Jerusalem containing ossuaries, or bone boxes, with inscriptions that may reference Jesus and his family. While the authenticity of these specific inscriptions remains debated, the skeletal remains found in similar tombs from the same period provide clear evidence about what people in Jesus' time and place actually looked like. Forensic anthropologist Josias, who has studied hundreds of skeletal remains from first-century Palestine, reports that the average male from this period was approximately 5 feet 1 inch tall, had a muscular build from manual labor, and possessed cranial features consistent with Middle Eastern and North African populations. These findings completely contradict the tall, slender, European-looking Jesus of Renaissance art and Hollywood movies. The most scientifically rigorous attempt to reconstruct Jesus' appearance was undertaken by British forensic anthropologist Richard Neve in collaboration with Israeli archaeologists. Using computer modeling techniques and skull measurements from first-century Palestinian remains, Neve created a reconstruction that shows Jesus as a dark-skinned, broad-faced man with short dark hair and beard. The resulting image looks nothing like traditional European depictions and everything like a typical Middle Eastern or North African man of the period. Genetic studies of modern Middle Eastern populations provide additional evidence about Jesus' likely appearance. DNA analysis of Palestinian, Lebanese, and Syrian populations shows strong genetic continuity with ancient populations in the region, suggesting that modern Middle Easterners provide a reasonable approximation of what first-century Palestinians look like. These populations typically have olive to brown skin, dark hair, and features that would be classified as non-European by modern standards. The field of paleodemography, which studies ancient population structures, has revealed that first-century Palestine was far more ethnically diverse than most people realize. The region sat at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, with constant migration and intermarriage creating a population that reflected influences from all three continents. The idea of a racially homogeneous population that looked distinctly European simply doesn't match the archaeological evidence. Climate studies provide additional insights into the environmental factors that would have influenced physical appearance in ancient Palestine. The region's intense solar radiation, high temperatures, and arid conditions would have favored individuals with darker skin pigmentation as protection against ultraviolet damage. Populations that had lived in this environment for generations would have developed the melanin-rich skin that we associate with Middle Eastern and African peoples. Isotope analysis of ancient teeth and bones can reveal information about diet, migration patterns, and geographic origins. Studies of first-century Palestinian remains show isotope signatures consistent with a Mediterranean diet rich in fish, olive oil, and grain, along with evidence of limited long-distance travel for most individuals. This data supports the biblical account of Jesus as someone who lived and worked primarily in the Galilee region, rather than traveling extensively outside Palestine. The study of ancient DNA has revolutionized our understanding of population movements and genetic relationships in the ancient world. Analysis of DNA extracted from ancient Palestinian remains shows genetic markers that link these populations more closely to modern Middle Eastern and North African groups than to European populations. While we don't have DNA from Jesus himself, the genetic profile of his contemporaries provides strong evidence about his likely ancestry and appearance. Textile analysis from first-century Palestinian archaeological sites reveals information about clothing styles and materials that contradict popular depictions of Jesus. Rather than the flowing white robes often seen in European art, archaeological evidence suggests that working-class men like Jesus would have worn shorter, more practical garments made from undyed wool or linen. These clothes would have been brown, gray, or natural colored rather than the pristine white associated with European religious imagery. Nutritional studies based on archaeological evidence reveal that first-century Palestinians had a diet that would have produced a different body type than European depictions suggest. The Mediterranean diet of the region, combined with the physical demands of manual labor, would have produced individuals who were shorter, more muscular, and more compact than the tall, slender figures common in European religious art. The analysis of ancient art and iconography from the region provides additional evidence about local appearance standards and artistic conventions. Mosaics, frescoes, and sculptures from first-century Palestine consistently depict people with darker skin, fuller features, and shorter stature than European artistic traditions. These local artistic traditions would have influenced how Jesus and his contemporaries were originally depicted. Linguistic analysis provides indirect evidence about Jesus' ethnic and cultural identity. The Aramaic language that Jesus spoke belongs to the Semitic language family, which is closely related to Hebrew and Arabic. The phonetic structure and vocabulary of these languages suggest speakers who had physical characteristics adapted to the Middle Eastern environment, including vocal tract configurations that may correlate with specific facial features. The study of ancient migration patterns reveals that Palestine in the 1st century was connected to Africa through well-established trade routes and population movements. The Via Maris, which passed through Galilee where Jesus lived, brought constant contact with African merchants, settlers, and travelers. This ongoing connection would have contributed to the genetic and cultural diversity of the region's population. Comparative studies of contemporary populations in similar environments provide additional insights into Jesus' likely appearance. People living in regions with similar climate, geography, and cultural conditions today typically have physical characteristics that align with Middle Eastern and North African populations rather than European ones. This environmental determinism suggests that Jesus would have looked like other people adapted to the Mediterranean climate. The convergence of all this scientific evidence points to one inescapable conclusion. The historical Jesus bore no resemblance to the European figure that has dominated Christian art for centuries. Instead, he was a dark-skinned, Middle Eastern man whose appearance would have been typical of the diverse, multicultural population of first-century Palestine. This scientific validation of biblical truth should revolutionize how Christians understand their Savior's identity. But the implications extend far beyond questions of physical appearance. This evidence reveals that the European Jesus was not just historically inaccurate but represents a fundamental distortion of Christian truth that has served racist ideologies for centuries. Are you ready to confront what this means for Christianity today? Something unprecedented is happening in Christianity right now, and it's going to transform the faith forever. After centuries of European domination and white supremacist distortion, the true face of Jesus is being revealed, and it's sparking a revolution that will shake the foundations of churches, seminaries, and Christian institutions around the world. This isn't just about correcting historical inaccuracies. This is about reclaiming the gospel from those who have used it as a weapon of oppression and returning it to its authentic purpose as a message of liberation for all people. The demographic shift in global Christianity is driving this revolution in ways that cannot be stopped or reversed. Today, over 60% of the world's Christians live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, regions where the European Jesus never made cultural sense and where authentic biblical truth is being rediscovered. These Christians are reading the same scriptures that Western Christians have read for centuries, but they're seeing truths that were hidden by European cultural assumptions and racial biases. African Christian artists are leading the charge in creating new visual representations of Jesus that reflect biblical truth rather than European fantasy. From the powerful paintings of Nigerian artist Brunabrak Pia to the stunning sculptures of Ghanaian artist Ella Natsui, African artists are depicting Jesus with the African features that would have been historically accurate. These images are spreading through social media, Christian publications, and church networks, challenging believers around the world to confront their assumptions about Jesus' identity. The Black Lives Matter movement has accelerated this Christian revolution by forcing conversations about race and representation that many churches had avoided for decades. When protesters began toppling statues of Confederate leaders and slave owners, some also began questioning why churches continued to display images of a white Jesus who looked nothing like the historical figure. This connection between racial justice and religious truth has created a powerful momentum for change. Young Christians, particularly those from diverse ethnic backgrounds, are rejecting the white Jesus imagery at unprecedented rates. Social media platforms are filled with memes, videos, and discussions that mock the European Jesus and celebrate more authentic representations. This generational shift is forcing church leaders to address questions they've long avoided and to consider how their imagery affects their credibility with younger believers. Theological seminaries are beginning to incorporate more historically accurate understandings of Jesus' appearance and cultural context into their curricula. Professors who once avoided discussions of race and representation are now teaching courses on the historical Jesus that include archaeological evidence, anthropological data, and cultural analysis. This academic shift is training a new generation of pastors and church leaders who understand the importance of biblical accuracy over cultural tradition. The entertainment industry is slowly beginning to reflect this revolution as well. Films like The Chosen have made efforts to cast Middle Eastern actors in biblical roles, while other productions are exploring more diverse representations of Jesus and the apostles. While Hollywood still has a long way to go, the pressure for authentic representation is growing as audiences become more aware of historical realities. Christian publishing is experiencing its own transformation as authors and publishers recognize the demand for more authentic biblical content. Books exploring the historical Jesus, the African roots of Christianity, and the impact of European colonialism on the faith are finding eager audiences. Publishers who once avoided these topics are now actively seeking manuscripts that address questions of race, representation, and religious truth. The revolution is also being driven by the growing influence of liberation theology movements around the world, from Latin American-based communities to African independent churches to Asian contextual theology movements. Christians in the global South are articulating understandings of Jesus that emphasize his identification with the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized. These theological movements naturally challenge European depictions of Jesus as a figure of privilege and power. Social media has become a powerful tool for spreading revolutionary ideas about Jesus' identity. Hashtags like Black Jesus, Historica Jesus, and Decolonize Christianity are connecting believers around the world who are committed to reclaiming authentic biblical truth. These online communities are sharing research, artwork, and personal testimonies that challenge traditional assumptions, promote more accurate understandings of Christian history. The revolution is encountering significant resistance from conservative Christian institutions that have invested heavily in maintaining traditional imagery and interpretations. Some denominations and church leaders are fighting back against efforts to diversify religious art and challenge European assumptions about Jesus' appearance. This resistance reveals how deeply white supremacist thinking has penetrated Christian institutions and how threatening authentic biblical truth can be to established power structures. But the resistance is ultimately futile, because the revolution is being driven by biblical truth itself. As more Christians study Scripture seriously and examine the historical evidence, they cannot avoid confronting the reality that Jesus looked nothing like the European figure they've been taught to worship. Truth has a way of emerging despite efforts to suppress it, and the truth about Jesus' identity is too powerful to be contained. The implications of this revolution extend far beyond questions of religious art and imagery. A Christianity that acknowledges Jesus' true identity must also confront the ways that European Christianity has been used to justify racism, colonialism, and oppression. This reckoning will require churches to examine their history, acknowledge their complicity in systems of injustice, and commit to becoming agents of liberation rather than oppression. The revolution is also creating new opportunities for Christian unity across racial and ethnic lines. When Christians of all backgrounds can see Jesus as someone who transcends European cultural assumptions, they can begin to understand the gospel as truly universal good news that speaks to all people regardless of their race or ethnicity. This understanding has the potential to heal divisions that have plagued Christianity for centuries. Educational institutions are being forced to update their curricula and teaching materials to reflect more accurate understandings of biblical history and Christian origins. Sunday school materials, vacation Bible school programs, and Christian education resources are slowly beginning to include more diverse representations of biblical figures and more historically accurate information about the ancient world. The revolution is being supported by a growing body of scholarly research that provides scientific and historical validation for more authentic representations of Jesus. As this research becomes more widely known and accepted, it becomes increasingly difficult for Christian institutions to justify maintaining European imagery that contradicts established facts about the historical Jesus. Perhaps most importantly, this revolution is returning Christianity to its authentic roots as a faith that emerged from the margins of society among people who were oppressed, marginalized, and despised by the powerful. The European Jesus represented a complete reversal of this original identity, transforming Christianity into a religion of the privileged and powerful. Reclaiming the true Jesus means reclaiming Christianity's original mission as good news for the poor and liberation for the oppressed. The revolution that's coming to Christianity cannot be stopped because it's powered by truth itself. As more believers encounter the authentic Jesus of history, they cannot return to the false European version that has dominated the faith for too long. This transformation will be painful for some and liberating for others, but it will ultimately restore Christianity to its biblical foundations and its universal mission. The question is not whether this revolution will succeed, but whether individual Christians and Christian institutions will embrace the truth or resist it. Those who choose truth will find themselves part of a movement that's transforming Christianity into a more authentic, more inclusive, and more powerful force for justice and liberation in the world. What will you choose when confronted with the truth about Jesus' identity? Will you cling to comfortable lies or embrace the revolutionary truth that can set you free? The time for decision is now, and the future of Christianity hangs in the balance. Tell us what you think in the comments below, and share this revelation with everyone who needs to hear the truth about the real Jesus of history.